Hello, Zer0 Books readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. This is the second video in a two-part series of videos on the topic of the intellectual dark web. It'll be about how these free speech warriors misunderstand and fear Marx, and how capitalist realism is contributing to the rise of the right and the weakness of the left. In the beginning of his book, Mark Fisher repeats a claim that today it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And this failure of imagination is precisely why Marx is so difficult to grasp. It's not that his ideas are so terribly complicated, but rather it's because he attempts to imagine the end of capitalism not merely in some mythic way, but systematically, that makes him difficult. The most reliable way to understand what Marx thought is to read what he wrote. But in preparation of picking up Capital Volume 1, you might try out listening to a few of Marx's right-wing critics and then assume that the opposite of what they say is true.
Anyways, the basic Marxist idea, as I'm sure most of you know, is that the social world and life itself is a battle between those who have and those who don't have. And that the reason that those who have is because they take it from those who do not have. And these are powerful ideas. There's a good book called Explaining Postmodernism that I might recommend by a guy named Stephen R.C. Hicks. And his first chapter, which isn't very long, is a good introduction to political correctness.
4 claims of classical socialism, Marxist version. First, the moral claims. Capitalism is exploitative. You have rich people, you have poor people. The rich people have the power. They use their power to keep the poor people down and to extract wealth from them. It's competitive, it's imperialistic, and so the capitalist profit motive brings out the worst in people, and it's a dog-eat-dog struggle, and so forth.
The most common misunderstanding or false claim that members of the intellectual dark web invoke involves Marx's conception of class. Their description of class as coming down to a division between the oppressors and the oppressed is not only overly simplified, but just plainly wrong. From Marx's perspective, the relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat is not defined by the greed of the bourgeoisie. It can't be thought of as a battle over social status. It is not even a relationship that relies on outright oppression in order to maintain itself. Rather, the class division between workers and bosses isn't fundamentally important at all. What is important, what must exist if capitalism is to exist, is the working class itself. From Marx's way of thinking, it is the working class that produces a system that sets up the tasks societies and states give themselves. It is a working class that creates abstract value that sets up equitable exchanges in the market. And it is a working class that transforms the wealth nature provides into commodities designed for human use. Capitalism doesn't always rely on oppression or violence to function. And once capitalism is underway, it is even possible that a given member of the proletariat might earn a decent living without facing any oppression at all. It's even possible that members of the bourgeoisie might face oppression from all manner of powers in a capitalist society. For Marx, understanding capitalism can't be done on a case-by-case basis, and finding the flaws in the capitalist system can never be accomplished by limiting ourselves to a search for acts of oppression or domination. Finding the victim doesn't help us understand the complexity of capitalism. Marx didn't start his book, Capital, with an examination of the trials of proletariat life in factories. He didn't start out describing class conflict, but rather he started with an exploration of the sorts of objects that the working classes produce under capitalism. Marx begins Capital with an examination of the commodity. Here's a clip from Brendan Cooney's Law of Value video series that explains a bit more.
Bourgeois economists have always seen the market as a realm of great freedom and equality. The fact that there is so much inequality, crisis, and unfulfilled freedom in market societies is seen as an imperfection in reality, not their theory. Contrary to what some people think, Marx does not start with an analysis of these social bads and then proceed to a critique of market relations. Marx doesn't begin by talking about monopoly, poverty, exploitation, or state violence. He begins with this same realm of market freedom that his bourgeois critics are so enamored with, and then shows how all of these social antagonisms spring out of this basic productive relation. For Marx, it all starts with the fact that capitalist production is production for market exchange. This basic form of production takes on law-like properties that he calls the law of value. What did Marx find so interesting about capitalist societies? It wasn't just the freedom to buy or sell anything you wanted. It was the fact that in order to participate in the social life of a market society, one has to buy and sell things. In order to survive, in order to participate in society, one has to enter the market to buy things and to sell the products of their own labor. This is a distinctly different organization of society than previous societies, where working people largely supported themselves with their own labor. That is, they labored to make things for their own use. In a capitalist society, people don't make things that have any use for themselves at all. They produce things in order to exchange them. Thus, the coordination of the social labor process happens indirectly through exchange. In a society of private producers, coordinated indirectly through the market, the social relations between these people take the form of relations between things, of commodity relations. The relations between people become value relations expressed in commodity prices. Economically, people can only relate to each other through money prices, through value. This world of commodity relations takes an independent form outside of the control of individuals that acts back upon and directs the flow of human affairs. Adam Smith called it the hidden hand of the market. Marx calls it the law of value.
It is impossible to understand neo-progressivism or the motivations of neo-progressive activists without understanding the dichotomy of individualism and collectivism. While this paradigm has fallen out of public discussion in the modern day, a century ago it was a common method to understand the purpose and consequences of political ideologies. Merriam-Webster defines individualism and collectivism as follows. Individualism. 1. A doctrine that the interests of the individual are or ought to be ethically paramount. Also the conception that all values, rights, and duties originate in individuals. 2. A theory maintaining the political and economic independence of the individual and stressing individual initiative, action, and interests. Collectivism. A political or economic theory advocating collective control, especially over production and distribution. 2. Emphasis on collective rather than individual action or identity.
Another mistake that members of the intellectual dark web make is arguing that Marx cared about serving the collective good and ignored the individual. In reality, nobody can really argue in such a one-sided way, and even bourgeois thinkers have to speak to both the individual and the collective good when they argue. Looked at closely, today's free market absolutists argue for protecting the rights of property owners on the basis that this will serve everyone's interests. And liberal Keynesians argue that in order for everyone to hold on to their rights as individuals, property rights must sometimes be tossed aside in favor of other rights, like the right to housing, or the right to health care, or to education, or to equal treatment under the law. Marx, while often supporting partial struggles for equality and freedom both, ultimately wanted to challenge the base of society. He wanted to overturn and replace what is often called the capitalist mode of production. Marx aimed at creating new rules, new terms, a new economic foundation for society, precisely because he saw the advent of socialism as the only way to make good on the promise of individual liberty. As the Marxist humanist Raya Dostoevskaya noted in an essay entitled Marx's Humanism Today, Marx once wrote, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but on the contrary, their social existence that determines their consciousness." What this meant was that in order to be free, humanity would have to take hold of their social existence. consciously setting up the terms of their social life, the shape and function of their collective work, was the only way to achieve liberation for every individual. And it's worth noting one other thing that Marx's commitment to individual liberty through a collective effort to reconfigure the rules and aims of social existence implies. Marx was committed to public reason and Enlightenment values just as much as any modern bourgeois philosopher might have been. The difference was the level or depth of Marx's critique of the already existing social order and Marx's commitment to living up to the promises the bourgeois revolutionaries made in the 18th and the 19th centuries. Here's why it matters, why it is important to correct the often willful ways a misunderstanding of Marx's thought has been promulgated. The reason it matters isn't because these misunderstandings convinced people like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson that Marx was evil. It isn't important to correct these misperceptions because liberals like Michael Dyson might have been brought over to a more radical position if only Marx could have been properly understood. Rather, the reason correcting the misunderstanding of Marx's thought is important is because without a loud and thoroughgoing defense of Marx's critiques of our current society and of other lesser critiques, we will be left with the Dysons of the world and the Petersons of the world to show us the way out. And let's be clear, of the two of them, the conservative Peterson is currently the more convincing advocate for the status quo. The left side of bourgeois society is currently losing ground, and it's for that reason that a critique of the bourgeois and the capitalist system must start to push its way into the marketplace of ideas.